The call came at 2:47 in the morning. Not to the police, not to a hospital, to a burner phone taped beneath a dumpster behind a laundromat on South Halsted Street, the only number that connected to the most dangerous secret in Chicago's South Side. 3 volunteers stood frozen at the back entrance of the clinic, staring at the body on the wet asphalt. One of them, Marcus, a 22-year-old pre-med student who had never seen a real gunshot wound in his life, was already backing away. "We call nobody," he whispered. "You understand me? Nobody. We lock the door, and we call nobody." The rain hammered the alley like it had a grudge, and then Evelyn Mercer pushed through all of them, knelt down in the filth and the blood without a second's hesitation, pressed 2 fingers to the man's neck, and said the 6 words that would change everything about her life. "He's alive. Get me the kit." If you were in her position, alone, exhausted, staring at a man whose face you didn't know, but whose wounds you recognized as deliberate, professional, and meant to kill, what would you have done? Before we go any further, if you've ever stayed up late watching stories like this one, stories about ordinary people caught in extraordinary moments, please hit subscribe right now and tap that bell. I put out new stories every week, and this one is only getting started. Drop a like and tell me in the comments, what city or country are you watching from tonight? I read every single one. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to that alley. The clinic didn't officially exist. That was the whole point. It operated out of the basement level of a converted auto repair shop on the corner of 49th and Racine, in a neighborhood where the city had quietly stopped maintaining the streetlights 3 years ago and quietly pretended not to notice. The sign above the garage bay still read Kowalski's Auto, the name of a man who died in 2019 and left the building to his daughter, who happened to be a nurse practitioner with a conscience the size of a freight train and absolutely no talent for following rules that got people killed. Her name was Sandra Kowalski. She ran the front. She handled the logistics, the scheduling, the careful, quiet recruitment of medical professionals willing to volunteer their off hours, treating patients who couldn't afford a copay, couldn't risk a paper trail, or simply couldn't walk into an ER without being deported, arrested, or worse. Evelyn Mercer had been volunteering there for 2 years. She came in twice a month on her days off from Northwestern Memorial, where she worked 12-hour shifts in the emergency department and was, by almost every measurable standard, one of the most competent physicians on the floor. Her attending, Dr. Patel, called her methodically aggressive, which he meant as a compliment, and she accepted as one. She was not fast because she was reckless. She was fast because she'd spent years training herself to make decisions under pressure without flinching, without second-guessing, and without the particular kind of emotional freeze that killed patients. She was 31 years old, and she hadn't slept a full night in longer than she could remember. That particular Thursday in October, she had been at the clinic since 8 in the evening. She'd treated a 57-year-old diabetic man whose foot was in early-stage necrosis because he hadn't been able to afford the insulin to control his blood sugar for 4 months. She'd treated a teenage girl with a dislocated shoulder and a bruise pattern on her upper arm that told a story the girl wasn't ready to put into words. She'd treated 2 kids with ear infections and a middle-aged woman whose abdominal pain turned out to be a hernia that needed surgical referral and a conversation about how they were going to make that happen without paperwork. By 2 in the morning, she was tired in the way that went past her bones and settled somewhere in her actual soul. She was standing at the utility sink in the back room, washing her hands for what felt like the 100th time that night, when she heard Marcus shouting, not calling, not talking, shouting, in the specific high-pitched register of a young man who had just encountered something that his entire nervous system was refusing to process. She didn't grab her coat. She didn't ask questions. She moved. The back door opened into a narrow service alley that ran between the clinic building and the brick wall of the apartment complex next door. There was a single overhead light mounted above the door, one of those yellow industrial bulbs that gave everything a sickly, jaundiced glow. The rain had been falling since midnight and showed no intention of stopping. 3 people were standing in a loose, horrified cluster about 8 feet from the door. Marcus, a volunteer named Delia, who was a retired LPN and normally the calmest person in the building, and a young man whose name Evelyn could never remember and who was already pulling out his phone. "Put that away," Evelyn said immediately. without even looking at what they were looking at. She said it because she knew instinctively that a phone meant either a call that shouldn't be made or a photo that shouldn't exist. Both were dangerous. Delia started. I see him. She did. He was lying on his left side about 4 feet from the wall, in the gap between two industrial trash containers. The position wasn't accidental. He'd crawled or been placed somewhere that wasn't immediately visible from either end of the alley. His clothing was dark, which meant the blood wasn't immediately obvious, but the rain was doing the work of making it unmistakable. A dark spreading bloom across the back of his jacket, another at his left side. His right hand was pressed flat against the asphalt in a way that suggested he'd been trying to push himself up and had run out of whatever he'd been running on. He looked like he was in his late 30s or early 40s, dark hair soaked flat against his forehead. A jaw that even slack and unconscious somehow managed to look like it belonged to someone who had never lost an argument in his life. Evelyn walked to him, knelt, ignored the cold water soaking immediately through the knees of her scrubs, and pressed 2 fingers to the carotid. Weak. But there. He's alive. Get me the kit. Evelyn. Marcus's voice cracked on her name like a teenager's. Look at him. Look at... That's not a car accident. Those are gunshots. If we touch him, if we treat him, and somebody finds out... Someone already found out something, Evelyn said without looking up. He's here, isn't he? She was already opening his jacket, her hands reading what her eyes couldn't fully see in the yellow light. Entry wound below the left shoulder blade. A second at the lower right back, slightly lateral, probably missed the kidney, but she wasn't making bets yet. His breathing was shallow and fast and wrong in a specific way that told her the first wound was the critical one. How long has he been out here? I don't know. I came out to take the trash and... Best guess, Marcus. 10 minutes? Maybe 15? She looked at the blood that had already mixed with the rainwater and was tracking in thin pink rivulets toward the drain at the alley's center. 15 minutes of blood loss. She did the math without thinking about it. Delia, get the portable kit, the full one, not the triage bag. Tell Sandra what we have and tell her I need the crash cart if the BP monitor shows below 70 systolic. Marcus, I need you to help me get him inside. Can you do that? Marcus stared at her. Can you do that? She repeated, and her voice was not unkind. It was simply the voice of someone who had already made the decision and was now asking whether he wanted to be part of the next 5 minutes or not. He swallowed. Yeah, okay. The young man with the phone had already left. Evelyn noted his absence and filed it under things to address later. Getting the stranger inside was harder than it should have been. He was heavier than he looked, not in the way of fat, but in the dense, settled way of someone whose body had been built to absorb things. He groaned once when they shifted him, a low guttural sound that meant pain, but also meant conscious enough to register it, which was something. They got him through the back door and onto the examination table in the rear procedure room, and by the time they did, Sandra was already there, and her face was doing something complicated. Sandra Kowalski was 53 years old and had spent 30 of those years in situations that should have broken her. She was not easily frightened, but standing in the doorway of her dead father's auto shop turned underground clinic, looking at the man on the table, she was frightened. Evelyn, she said quietly, look at his hands. Evelyn was already cutting away the jacket. I see his hands. Do you know what those rings mean? The rings were thick gold and featured a specific kind of design that Sandra, who had grown up in Chicago and paid attention to the kinds of things that kept you alive, recognized immediately. I know what they might mean, Evelyn said. I also know he's going into hemorrhagic shock, and I've got maybe 12 minutes before that becomes irreversible. So I'm going to need everyone in this room to make a choice right now. You can leave. No judgment. Lock the door behind you, and I'll handle this alone. Or you can stay and help me do what we do here, which is treat people who need treating. Those are the options. Sandra looked at her for a long moment. Then she crossed the room, pulled on gloves, and said, What do you need first? Marcus stayed too. The young man with the phone was never seen at the clinic again. The next 6 hours were the longest of Evelyn Mercer's life, and she had logged some very long hours. The first wound, the one below the shoulder blade, was the one that wanted to kill him. The bullet had tracked at a downward angle, which told her the shooter had been above him and had clipped the edge of the left lung before lodging somewhere in the mid-thoracic region she couldn't safely reach without imaging equipment she didn't have. The lung wasn't fully collapsed, but it was compromised, and the pressure was building in a way she couldn't ignore. She intubated him. In a proper hospital, this would have been a 2-minute procedure with an anesthesiologist standing by and a full team monitoring vitals. In the back room of a converted auto shop at 2:30 in the morning with a retired LPN and a terrified pre-med student as her support, it took 6 minutes and every ounce of focus she had ever developed in her entire medical career. When the airway was secure, she exhaled exactly once, let herself have exactly 1 second of relief, and moved to the chest. She needed to decompress the lung. She had a needle. She had her training. She had the knowledge that if she got the placement wrong by even a centimeter, she could make everything significantly worse. She got it right. She would not let herself think about what would have happened if she hadn't. The second wound was less immediately dangerous, but still required attention. A through and through at the lower right back that had, by some combination of anatomy and luck she wasn't going to question, managed to avoid every major structure it could have destroyed. She cleaned it, packed it, and moved on. At some point in the third hour, the stranger regained a thin thread of consciousness. Not enough to speak, not enough to move. Just enough for his eyes to open briefly, fix on the ceiling, and then, with what looked like a tremendous and exhausted act of will, find her face. He looked at her for a long moment. She said, "You're going to be okay. Don't try to move." His eyes closed again. She had no idea who he was. She hadn't asked. It didn't matter, not in that room, not at that hour. What mattered was the physiology. What mattered was the next decision, and the one after that. Sandra made coffee at some point. Bad coffee. The cheap kind in the big industrial can they bought because nobody who came to this clinic needed to be spending money on good coffee. Evelyn drank 2 cups without tasting either of them. By 5 in the morning, his pressure had stabilized. By 6, his breathing had improved to the point where she felt cautiously, provisionally, reluctantly optimistic. By 6:45, the rain had stopped. By 7, the first gray light was coming through the small, high window above the sink, and Evelyn was sitting in a folding chair next to the examination table, elbows on her knees, staring at the floor and doing the kind of decompression that her body demanded after sustained crisis. She was not a dramatic person. She did not cry with relief. She did not say a prayer or feel a transcendent sense of purpose wash over her. She felt tired. She felt the specific, hollowed-out exhaustion of someone who has given everything their body and mind had to give and is now waiting to see if it was enough. She looked at him. In the gray morning light, without the immediate emergency sharpening her perception, she actually looked at him for the first time. Strong face. A scar along the left jaw that was old enough to be silver white against his skin. Not the angry red of something recent. His hands, resting at his sides now, were not the hands of a man who had spent his life behind a desk. The rings, the cut of the jacket she'd had to destroy, even ruined, she could see it had been expensive in the way that meant someone had measured him for it, not grabbed a size off a rack. "Who are you?" she said quietly. She didn't mean for him to answer. He was barely conscious, but he heard her. His eyes opened. Dark, very dark, and clearer now than they'd been at any point in the night. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Not gratitude, not exactly, or not only that, something more complicated, like a man encountering a phenomenon he doesn't have an existing category for. He said nothing. After a moment, she said, "It doesn't matter. You're stable. You need a real hospital for the lung, but I'm guessing that's not going to happen." She paused. "You're going to need to rest for at least— How long?" His voice was rough from the intubation, barely above a rasp. "You were in critical condition for most of the night. Realistically, 2 weeks before you're walking without pain, 4 before you should be doing anything strenuous. And that's with proper follow-up care, which— How long before I can leave here?" She looked at him. "That's what you're asking me." He didn't answer. He didn't need to. Evelyn sat back in her chair. She was tired enough that she'd moved past the filter that normally existed between what she thought and what she said out loud, and what she thought was, course, that's what you're asking. Because leaving is all that matters. Not what it costs to keep you here. Not the people who stayed up all night in a building they can't officially acknowledge. Not anything except when you can go. She didn't say that. What she said was, another few hours, minimum. I want to monitor the lung before you try to move. She stood up. I'll get you water. She was almost to the door when he spoke again. You didn't call anyone. She stopped. No, she said, without turning around. Why not? There were a lot of honest answers to that question. Because the people she could have called would have wanted names and paperwork and a trail that led back to this building and the people in it. Because the oath she'd taken the day she graduated from medical school was not conditional on the patient's criminal record. Because she had looked at him bleeding in that alley, and the only thing her brain had produced was a clinical assessment, not a moral referendum. But she was tired. So she just said the simplest true thing. Because you needed help. She went to get the water. When she came back 20 minutes later, he was gone. No note. No name. No explanation. The blanket she'd covered him with was folded. Not thrown aside, not dropped on the floor, but actually folded into a neat rectangle and placed at the end of the table, which she found, in a strange and probably irrational way, oddly telling about the kind of man he was. She stood there for a moment looking at the folded blanket. Then she stripped off her gloves, dropped them in the waste bin, and began the long process of cleaning up. She went home at 8:15. She was asleep before 9, the dreamless, gravity well sleep of total physical depletion. She slept for 17 hours. She woke at 2 in the morning the next day to a sound she had never heard in her quiet suburban street in Rogers Park. The sound of engines. Many engines, all of them cutting off at the same moment, which created a silence that was somehow louder than the sound had been. She lay in the dark of her bedroom and stared at the ceiling for 3 seconds. Then she got up, walked to the window, pulled the curtain aside 2 inches, and looked out. The street was lined with black SUVs, both directions as far as she could see in either direction, parked with their headlights off, engines dead, and standing between them, on the sidewalks, on the lawns, in the street itself, men, dozens of them, all in dark clothing, all standing with the particular stillness of people who have been trained to stand still. She counted without meaning to. It was a habit of mind. Her brain kept trying to process it as something other than what it was. She stopped counting at 60, and there were more that she couldn't see. Her neighbor's porch light came on. Then another. She could see a curtain moving across the street. Old Mr. Hennessy, who was 81 and a Vietnam veteran and frightened by very little, was standing at his window with a phone in his hand. The street had gone so quiet she could hear faintly the sound of her own heartbeat. And then, from the line of vehicles closest to her front walk, a single figure separated from the rest. He moved without hurrying. He moved like a man who had never once needed to hurry because the world had always stopped and waited for him. He walked up her front path and stopped at the base of her porch steps. In the cold blue wash of the streetlight, she could see his face clearly even through the window. Dark hair. A jaw that even at this distance somehow conveyed the memory of an argument never lost. His left side moved slightly stiffly, exactly the way she'd told him it would, for at least 2 weeks. He looked up at her window. He couldn't see her through the curtain, she was certain of that, and yet he looked directly at her. The man she had pulled back from the edge of death in an alley 2 nights ago was standing in front of her house with what looked like 200 armed men behind him, and every single one of her neighbors was now awake, watching, and completely certain she was about to die. Evelyn Mercer's hand on the curtain was not quite steady, but she did not step back. She opened the front door before he could knock. That was the first thing Damien Falcone noticed. Not the fact that she was still in the same worn gray hoodie she'd probably slept in, not the dark circles under her eyes that told him she hadn't gotten nearly enough rest, not even the absence of fear on her face, which was remarkable enough on its own given what was standing behind him on her street. What he noticed was that she opened the door before he knocked. She'd been watching. She'd seen him coming, and she hadn't hidden, hadn't called anyone, hadn't done the thing that 99 out of 100 people would have done, which was put something solid between herself and the unknown. She just opened the door and looked at him. "You shouldn't be walking on that yet," she said. "Not without support. He stared at her. Of all the things he had expected the woman who saved his life to say when she found 200 of his soldiers outside her house at 2 in the morning, medical criticism had not made the list. "May I come in?" he said. She stepped aside. He moved through her doorway carefully. She was right. The left side pulled with every step, a deep stitching pain that the adrenaline of the last 48 hours had been suppressing, and that was now making itself loudly known. And she closed the door behind him without looking at the street, without acknowledging the men, without doing anything except leading him toward the small living room off the hallway. The house was modest in the specific way of someone who could afford more but had never gotten around to caring. Bookshelves that were actually used, not decorated. A couch with a blanket thrown over the back of it. A coffee table with a medical journal open face down on it. And a mug of something that had gone cold sitting next to a phone showing 3 missed calls from a contact labeled simply Sandra. Evelyn sat in the chair across from the couch. She didn't offer him coffee. She didn't make small talk. She sat down, folded her hands in her lap, and looked at him with an expression that was doing the impressive work of being both completely composed and completely furious at the same time. "Talk," she said. Damien sat. He didn't wince, but the effort of not wincing was visible, and he saw her clock it immediately. The small professional tightening around her eyes, the involuntary assessment. "My name is Damien Falcone," he said. "I know who you are," she said. "I figured it out about 6 hours after you disappeared. Sandra recognized your rings. I looked you up." A pause. "I wish I hadn't." "What did you find?" "Enough." Her voice was flat. "Enough to understand why 3 people in that alley were terrified and why the smartest of them ran. Enough to understand that by treating you, I potentially put everyone in that building in danger." She looked at him steadily. "Was I wrong?" Damien was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said. "But not in the way you think." "Then explain it to me, because from where I'm sitting, Mr. Falcone, the explanation that makes the most sense is that the most dangerous man in Chicago is currently sitting on my couch with an army in my yard, and I would like to understand whether I should be afraid of you right now." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, with a directness that she hadn't expected, "No, not of me. That's not reassuring. That implies there's someone else I should be afraid of." "There is," he said. "That's why they're outside." She absorbed that. Her jaw tightened slightly. Not fear, he was becoming certain, but the specific tightening of someone who has just had their worst hypothesis confirmed and is angry that they were right. "Somebody leaked your location," she said. Not a question. "Within hours of my leaving your clinic, yes, someone inside my organization made sure that the right people knew which doctor had treated me, which clinic, which street. And those people want to finish what they started in that alley." He said it plainly, without theater. "The men outside your house are not a threat to you. They're the reason you're still alive to have this conversation." Evelyn stood up. She didn't pace. She walked to the window, looked at the street for one long moment, and turned back around. Her face had gone through something while her back was turned, some rapid internal reckoning that he couldn't see but could feel in the quality of silence she brought back with her. "I didn't ask for this," she said. "No. I treated you because you were dying in an alley, not because I wanted any part of whatever this is. I know that. And now you're telling me that doing the right thing, the only thing a physician with a functioning conscience could have done, has made me a target." "Yes," she breathed out through her nose, hard. "That's insane." "Yes," he said again, and then, with what she would later recognize as the closest thing to vulnerability she would ever hear in his voice in those early days, "I'm sorry." She looked at him sharply, like the word had surprised her. "Don't do that," she said. "Don't apologize?" "Don't apologize and then leave those men on my street. One or the other, Mr. Falcone. Either you're sorry, in which case you take them and you go and you figure out your own problems without involving me. Or you need them here, in which case you skip the apology because we both know it doesn't change anything." He said nothing. "Which is it?" she pressed. "They stay," he said. And I am sorry. Both things are true. She stared at him. Then she picked up her cold coffee, looked at it, set it back down without drinking it, and said, I want them off my lawn by 6 a.m. My neighbors have already seen enough, and I have to go to work in 4 hours and explain to my hospital why there are news vans on my street. News vans? 2 of them. On the corner. I saw them pull up about 20 minutes before you. She met his eyes. You have a leak, Mr. Falcone, and it isn't small. The thing that crossed Damien Falcone's face in that moment was not an expression Evelyn had words for yet. She would, later. She would come to recognize it as the look of a man whose entire architecture of control is developing a crack he cannot immediately locate, and who is deciding in real time how angry to let himself be about it. He pulled out his phone, made a call in under 10 seconds, said 4 words in Italian she didn't catch, and ended it. They'll move to the perimeter, he said. Less visible, but they're staying. I didn't agree to that. No, he said. You didn't. And I'm not asking you to. I'm telling you it's happening because the alternative is that you drive to Northwestern Memorial in 4 hours without protection, and the people who want to use you to get to me have a window. He paused. I won't let that happen. You don't get to decide that. I already did. The air between them went tight as a held breath. Evelyn Mercer had spent 11 years in emergency medicine, developing the ability to remain calm in rooms where people were dying, screaming, or both. She had talked down a man with a knife in an ER bay. She had delivered devastating diagnoses without her voice breaking. She was not a woman who was easily overpowered by another person's force of will. But Damien Falcone, sitting in her living room at 2 a.m. with stitches in his side that she had placed herself, telling her calmly that her input was noted and overruled. That was a specific kind of infuriating she hadn't prepared for. Get out of my house, she said. Quietly. Tonight. He stood. Slowly, carefully, with the particular dignity of a man determined not to show pain even when it was radiating off him in visible waves. I'll have someone bring you a number, he said. If anything changes, if you see anything that feels wrong, use it. I won't. Then keep it anyway. He left. She stood in the middle of her living room listening to the sound of her own breathing for a full minute after the door closed. Then she picked up her phone and called Sandra back. Sandra answered on the first ring, which meant she hadn't slept either. Tell me you're okay, Sandra said immediately. I'm fine. He's gone. Are they still out there? Evelyn went back to the window. The SUVs had moved, pulled back, redistributed, tucked into side streets and driveways with considerably more subtlety than before, but they were still there. She could see a figure in dark clothing standing at the corner under the dead streetlight, hands at his sides, motionless. Yes, she said. Sandra was quiet for a moment. Then, Evelyn, the young man who left that night, the one with the phone. Evelyn's hand tightened on her own phone. What about him? His name is Kevin Tran. He volunteered with us for 8 months, pre-nursing. Very sweet kid, I thought. Another pause. I got a call this morning from a friend in Pilsen who knows things. She said Kevin was seen 2 nights ago getting into a car outside a bar on 26th Street. Not his car. A car belonging to men she recognized. The cold settled into Evelyn's stomach like something physical. He was the one who talked, she said. I think so. Does he know what he started? I don't think, Sandra said carefully, that Kevin Tran had any idea who he was selling information to or what they would do with it. He probably thought he was calling in a tip for reward money and didn't think past that. But it doesn't matter what he thought. No, Sandra agreed. It doesn't. Evelyn stood at her window and looked at the figure on the corner for a long time. Close the clinic, she said. For now, until we know what the exposure is. Evelyn, I know. I know what it means. I know there are people who need us, but if they find the clinic, Sandra, everyone in it is at risk. Close it. 2 weeks. Then we'll reassess. Sandra didn't like it. Evelyn could hear it in the silence, but she also heard the moment Sandra made her peace with it. 2 weeks, Sandra said. Then we talk. Thank you. She hung up. She did not go back to bed. She sat at her kitchen table until the sky outside began its reluctant gray transition toward morning, drinking bad coffee from her own pot and reading absolutely nothing on the phone in her hand. At precisely 5:45, a black car she didn't recognize pulled up in front of her house. A man she'd never seen, mid-30s, built like he'd been specifically engineered for the purpose of standing between other people and whatever was coming, walked up her path and slid a card under her door without knocking. On one side, a phone number. No name. On the other, in handwriting that was unexpectedly clean and precise for a man she was fairly certain had killed people. You saved my life. The least I can do is try not to ruin yours. D. She put the card on the kitchen table. She looked at it for a while. Then she got up, got dressed, and drove to work. The next 5 days were the worst kind of difficult, which is the kind that looks normal from the outside. She worked her shifts, she treated patients, she answered questions from her charge nurse about the circus on your block, with a vague story about a stalker situation being handled by law enforcement, which was almost not a lie depending on your definitions. She ate hospital cafeteria food at odd hours and slept in increments and tried very hard not to check whether the dark car was still parked on the cross street visible from the employee parking lot. It was always still there. On the third day, she found a man she'd never seen sitting in the waiting area of Northwestern's ER with no visible injury and no apparent intention of seeking treatment. He was there when she arrived. He was there 7 hours later when she looked up from a chart. When her shift ended and she walked out, he fell into step about 30 feet behind her and maintained that distance to the parking garage, where another man she also didn't know was standing near her car. They said nothing. They did nothing threatening. They simply existed in her vicinity with the specific patient permanence of fixtures. She stood next to her car and said, to no one in particular, "I know you're here. You can stop pretending." The man near her car looked at her with the expression of someone making a real-time calculation. "Ma'am," he said, "what's your name?" A pause. "Caruso." "Caruso, tell Mr. Falcone that I need to speak with him, tonight." Caruso's expression didn't change. "I'll pass that along." "Do that." Damien was at her door at 9 p.m. This time he knocked. She had made actual coffee. He sat at her kitchen table instead of the living room, which was different, more functional, more adversarial in a specific way, like two people who were going to negotiate rather than converse. He noticed the card on the table. He didn't comment on it. "Your men are inside the hospital," she said, sitting across from him with both hands around her mug. "2 men." "Yes." "That's not acceptable. That's a clinical environment. There are privacy laws. There was an attempt," he said, "yesterday morning, outside the hospital's east entrance. One of my people intervened before it reached you." She stopped. "What kind of attempt?" "A car. Moving too fast in the staff parking lane. May have been nothing." He held her gaze. "May not have been." Her fingers tightened around the mug. "And you're only telling me now." "I'm telling you now because I wanted to be certain before I alarmed you unnecessarily." "That is not your call to make. Everything about this is my call to make." His voice didn't rise. Didn't need to. "You are in this position because of me. Whatever protection you receive or don't receive is a consequence of that. I understand you don't want this. I understand you built your life to be nothing like what it currently is. But wanting things to be different and making them different are not the same, Dr. Mercer. And right now the distance between you and something permanent is considerably smaller than you'd like to believe." She looked at him across her kitchen table. "Who are they?" she said. "The people trying to—" "That's being handled. I'm not asking for operational details. I'm asking who has decided that a doctor who treated a stranger in an alley deserves to be run over in a parking lot." He was quiet for a moment, just long enough for her to recognize that the answer existed and that he was deciding whether she was entitled to it. "Someone I trusted," he said finally. "For a long time." The weight of that hung in the small kitchen like smoke. "And do they know—" she started. "They know everything about you by now, yes. Your name, your address, where you work, where you volunteer, how you spend your time, who matters to you." He paused. "Sandra Kowalski. Your clinic." Evelyn went absolutely still. "Sandra has nothing to do with this." She has everything to do with this, he said, not unkindly, because she was there. Because if someone wants to find a way to pressure you, to move you, to make you do something you wouldn't otherwise do, the path goes through the people you're willing to suffer for. That's not a threat. That's an assessment. She stood up, walked to the sink, stood with her back to him for a moment, then turned around. "What do you need from me?" she said. And the fact that she asked it, the fact that she stood in her own kitchen and set down the argument and asked the practical question, seemed to do something to him, something he didn't quite have a face for. "Your patience," he said, "and a few days. For what?" "To find the source and end it. And if you can't," he looked at her steadily, "I will." The certainty in those two words was not the bravado of a man performing confidence. It was something older and quieter than that, something that had been built over years in a world where uncertainty was the thing most likely to get you killed, and certainty was the only armor worth wearing. She sat back down. 2 days, she said. "After that, we renegotiate everything." Agreed. She pushed her coffee mug toward the center of the table. Not an offering exactly, just a small movement that meant the immediate confrontation was over. "Your stitches," she said. "Are they holding?" He blinked. Once. The first genuinely unprepared expression she'd seen on his face. "Yes." "You're favoring the left side when you sit. You shouldn't be doing that 2 days from now either, but you especially shouldn't be doing it now. It means you're compensating and you're going to pull something." He looked down at himself as if only now noticing the tilt he'd unconsciously adopted. "I'll keep that in mind," he said. "Do that." She picked up her mug. "I'm going to sleep. Caruso can let himself out." She was 3 steps from the kitchen when he said, "Why did you really do it? That night? Don't say the oath. People have oaths they don't keep all the time." She stopped walking. She stood in the doorway with her back to him and thought about it. Actually thought about it. Not the version she'd given him the first time, the simple, clean version that was true but not complete. "I was 17, she said. "My mother had a stroke at 2 in the morning in a neighborhood where the hospitals were 40 minutes away, and the nearest one turned her away because her insurance had lapsed 2 weeks before." She paused. "She lived, but not because of them." Another pause, longer. "I've been angry about that for a long time. Long enough that treating people who have nowhere else to go stopped feeling like a choice and started feeling like the only thing that made any of the rest of it worth it." She didn't turn around. "So no," she said. "It wasn't just the oath. It was also spite. And you're welcome." She went to bed. Damien sat alone in her kitchen for a while. Then he stood, carefully, with the specific caution of a man aware of his own stitching, and left. He sat in the back of his car for a long moment, the city moving past the tinted windows, before he picked up his phone and called the number he'd been putting off calling for 3 days. "I need you to pull everything," he said when the line connected. "Every financial record, every communication, every movement logged in the last 6 months. Cross-reference against the timeline from the night of the 14th. He paused. "Yes, everyone, including the inner circle." Another pause, longer. "Especially the inner circle." He hung up. His consigliere, Raphael Moretti, was 58 years old and had been at Damien's right hand for 11 years. He had attended Damien's father's funeral. He had helped consolidate the empire through 3 transition crises and 2 federal investigations. He had been, for more than a decade, the single person in Damien's world Damien had trusted with things he trusted no one else with. At 11:15 that same night, while Damien was riding back toward his building, an analyst named Jin in his intelligence operation pulled a flagged communication from a burner number that had originated from inside the Falcone organization's inner meeting room, a room with a physical radio blocker installed precisely to prevent unauthorized transmissions. Except the transmission hadn't been radio, it had been hardwired. A small device, professionally installed, buried in the wall behind the thermostat. Something that had required access to the room, knowledge of the location, and the specific technical capability to defeat the existing security without triggering it. The list of people with all 3 of those things was very short. Jin pulled up the access log for that room over the past 8 weeks, cross-referenced it against the flagged communication window, ran the overlap. One name appeared with absolute consistency. He stared at it for a long time. Then he picked up the phone and called Damien. Damien answered immediately. "Tell me," he said. Jin told him. The silence that followed lasted 9 seconds. Jin counted. Then Damien said very quietly, "Get me the financial records going back 18 months. Everything that touches the Moretti account." "Damien," Jin started. "Do it tonight." He hung up. The car moved through the dark city streets. Buildings slid past the windows. Chicago at midnight. The elevated trains rattling on their old tracks. The distant sound of sirens that was so constant it had become the city's white noise. The lights of 1,000 windows where 1,000 lives were proceeding in complete ignorance of what was currently unraveling in the back of a black car on the near north side. Rafael Moretti, 11 years. The assassination attempt in that alley had not been a rival family making a move. It had not been a federal operation. It had not been any of the 17 other possibilities Damien had been running and discarding for the past week. It had been the man sitting at his right hand at every table, in every meeting, through every decision that had shaped the last decade of his life. And now that man knew about Evelyn Mercer. Damien's phone lit up again. A text from a number he recognized as one of his street captains. 4 words. Moretti just left the city. He read it twice. Then he looked out the window at the passing street. Rafael knew. Somehow, Rafael knew the investigation had gotten close enough to run, which meant the situation had just changed entirely, because a man with 11 years of intimate knowledge of Damien's organization, running scared, was not a problem that would stay contained. He would reach out to enemies. He would trade information for protection. He would burn everything he could reach on his way out. Not because he was careless, but because he was very, very good at what he did. And the one piece of information he currently had that was worth the most to the people most willing to hurt Damien, the one thing he could trade to buy himself the most time and the most safety, was the location, the name, and the complete vulnerability of the woman in Rogers Park. The woman who had no protection except the men Damien had stationed outside her house. The woman who had, 6 hours ago, told him she was going to sleep. He called Caruso. "Double the detail," he said, "right now, and I need 2 men inside the house. If she fights you on it, tell her—" He stopped. Tell her what, exactly? That the man who had leaked her identity in the first place had just run, which meant the situation she'd been living in for a week was about to get dramatically worse. That the 2 days he'd promised her had just become 2 hours. That the careful, controlled operation he'd been running to find and close the source had just collapsed into something much faster and much uglier. "Tell her it's temporary," he said. "Tell her we have movement on the situation." "And if she doesn't let us in?" Damien thought of her standing in her kitchen doorway, not turning around, telling him about her mother and about spite, and about the only thing that made any of the rest of it worth it. "She'll let you in," he said. He wasn't entirely sure of that. But Rafael Moretti was somewhere in this city, burning what he could reach. And Evelyn Mercer was asleep in a house with 2 men on the perimeter and no idea that the threat had just changed shape entirely, and Damien Falcone, for the first time in a very long time, was sitting in the back of a car with his hands not quite still in his lap, trying to remember the last time something mattered enough to make his hands unsteady. He couldn't remember the last time that had happened. The car had been circling for 12 minutes, not directionless, but the driver knew better than to ask where they were going when Damien hadn't said. You learned that quickly, working for Damien Falcone. You learned to read the silences and understand which ones meant wait and which ones meant move, and which ones meant something was happening in that precise and dangerous mind that hadn't resolved itself into an order yet. This was the third kind. His phone lit up again, Jin not texting this time, calling, which Jin never did unless the text wouldn't be enough. Damien answered, "Talk." "The financial cross-reference is done." Jin's voice had the particular flatness of someone delivering information they wish they weren't responsible for. 18 months. There are 17 irregular transfers out of the Moretti operational account. Total amount is 4.3 million, moved in increments small enough to avoid internal flags. A pause. The destination accounts trace back through 4 shells before they dead end, but the pattern of the shells, the legal structures, the jurisdictions, matches the setup used by the Cavallo family's financial operation. Damien said nothing. Damien. The Cavallos have been paying Rafael Moretti for 18 months. That means everything your organization did in that window. Every decision, every negotiation, every move against rival families. The Cavallos knew about it before it happened. Another pause, shorter. The hit in the alley wasn't an assassination attempt. It was a termination notice. Rafael had been promising them you'd be dead by the end of Q3, and you weren't, and they decided to handle it themselves. Which means Rafael knew it was coming. He set up the location, the timing. He arranged to have you where you were that night. The city moved past the windows. Damien thought about the meeting 3 weeks ago that had brought him to that neighborhood. A tip from a source Rafael had vouched for. An opportunity Rafael had framed as too good to delay. A location Rafael had specifically suggested for its discretion. Every single detail of that night, assembled by the man who had sat at his right hand for 11 years. "Where is he?" Damien said. "Moving. His car pinged a camera on the Eisenhower about 20 minutes ago, heading west. We think he's going for the private airfield in Addison that the Cavallos use for how long before he's airborne? 40 minutes? Maybe 50? Send the location to Caruso's team." A pause. Very brief. "Tell them alive." "Alive, Jin. That's not optional." "Understood. And get me everything on the Cavallo financial structure. Everything. I want names, account numbers, and whoever their legal counsel is, because I'm going to need every piece of that when this is over." He hung up. He sat for exactly 4 seconds. Then, "Take me to Rogers Park." The driver didn't ask why. The car turned north. Damien called Caruso. It rang 3 times, which was 2 times too many. Caruso answered with an edge in his voice that Damien recognized immediately as the specific tension of a man who was already managing a situation. "Talk to me," Damien said. "We have a problem." Caruso's breathing was slightly elevated. Not panicked. Caruso didn't panic, it wasn't in his architecture, but elevated. "Street camera on this block went dark about 8 minutes ago. Physical camera. Someone cut the line. Martinez went to check the east perimeter, and I lost contact with him 4 minutes ago." Damien's hand tightened around the phone. "Is she inside?" Last visual was 11:42. She was in the house. Lights in the bedroom. No movement. "How many do you have on site right now?" 6. "Martinez is unaccounted. I sent 2 to find him. That leaves me 4 on the house." Rafael's people are professional, and they had a head start. Damien was already thinking through the geometry of it, the street layout, the entry points, the fact that professional mercenaries with 18 months of Falcone operational intelligence would know exactly where each of his men was positioned and how they'd been placed, because Rafael had approved the protection detail structure in the first place. "They'll hit from the south side alley, same entry point as the clinic. It's what they know works." How long until... A sound came through the phone. Not close. Maybe a block. Maybe less. A sound that Caruso recognized and Damien recognized across the phone line simultaneously. The dense, flat percussion of a shaped charge taking down something structural. The line stayed open. Damien heard Caruso shout 2 names, heard the shift in ambient sound that meant Caruso was moving, and then the line went to static. Caruso. Nothing. Caruso. He was already out of the car before it fully stopped, which he knew was tactically wrong and did it anyway, because the alternative was sitting in the car on a dark street 2 blocks away while the phone gave him static. He ran. Running hurt. The left side screamed at him with every impact. The stitches Evelyn had placed with such precise and careful hands pulling against tissue that wasn't ready for this, and he ran anyway, because the calculation was simple and brutal. Pain was temporary and recoverable, and whatever was happening in that house in the next 60 seconds might not be. He came around the corner onto her street and stopped. The house was lit from inside in a way it shouldn't have been. Not the warm, ordinary light of someone awake in the living room. The specific orange-white of something burning. The front perimeter was down. He could see one of his men on the lawn, not moving. Another by the front gate, down on one knee, pressing something to his arm, alive but out of the fight. The front door was open. Damien moved. Later, he would not be fully able to reconstruct the next 4 minutes in sequential order. Memory under extreme physical stress didn't record linearly. It captured intensity, snapshots, the visceral detail of individual moments without the connective tissue between them. What he remembered: the smoke already thickening in the front hallway from something burning in the kitchen, not a structure fire yet, but building toward one. A man he didn't recognize coming around the corner of the staircase, and the 2 seconds of violent reckoning that followed. Caruso's voice from somewhere in the back of the house, still giving orders, which meant Caruso was alive. The sound of breaking glass from upstairs. He went upstairs. The bedroom door was open. The room was empty, the bed sheets thrown back in the specific disordered way of someone who had come out of sleep fast and moved fast. Not panic, but urgency, which meant she'd been awake enough to move deliberately rather than stumble. The bathroom, also empty. The small second bedroom she used as a home office, door closed. He opened it. Evelyn Mercer was standing against the far wall with a desk lamp in her right hand held like a weapon, wearing a gray t-shirt and flannel pants, her hair loose, and her eyes doing the specific focused calculation of someone who has already committed to the next action and is waiting for the trigger. She saw him. Something in her face shifted. Not relief, not yet, but the recognition that the threat calculus had just changed. "There's a man on the landing," she said immediately. "He went past the door about 3 minutes ago. I heard at least 2 others downstairs." "How long ago did the power go?" 12 minutes. The smoke alarm in the kitchen went off about 4 minutes after that. I didn't go down." She lowered the lamp by about 2 inches, not all the way. "I should tell you that I considered going out the window." "Why didn't you?" "Second floor onto concrete with no way to know what's on the ground." A pause. "Also, I was angry." He almost said something, decided against it. "Stay behind me," he said. "Gladly." The next 6 minutes were the kind of minutes that rearranged things permanently. Damien moved through her house with the efficiency of a man who had spent decades in spaces where hesitation was the thing most likely to get you killed. And Evelyn Mercer stayed exactly where she was told to stay, and did not make the mistake of getting in the way or the other mistake of freezing. When a man came through the door at the bottom of the staircase, she did something that surprised him. She threw the lamp. Hard, with accuracy that suggested either natural athleticism or fury, and it bought him the half-second he needed. He noted it, filed it. The ground floor was clearing. Caruso had 2 men functioning, and the mercenaries, 5 in total, by his count, had lost the element of surprise and the advantage of the confusion that the power cut and the fire were supposed to create. Without those, they were operating in someone else's house against people who were no longer caught flat-footed. 3 were down, 2 ran. Damien let them run. He had what he needed, which was the address that one of them had been carrying, a physical slip of paper in a shirt pocket, because professional mercenaries didn't put operational addresses in phones. He had it in his hand before the man was fully finished falling, and what it told him was that the staging location for this operation was not in Addison, where Raphael was supposedly running, but 12 miles south in a warehouse district that Damien recognized immediately as the edge of Cavallo-controlled territory. Raphael hadn't run. Raphael had stayed to watch. The fire in the kitchen was containable, a small incendiary device on the counter designed more to generate chaos and smoke than to actually bring down the building. Caruso's man had it out in under 4 minutes with the extinguisher from under the sink. The house smelled of smoke and the particular chemical sharpness of a space that had been violated, rifled, turned into something other than what it was supposed to be. Evelyn stood in the middle of her kitchen, in the dark, because the power was still out, with a flashlight one of Caruso's men had given her. She was looking at her counter where the device had been, looking at the scorched surface of the kitchen where she made coffee in the mornings, where she'd sat across from Damien 2 nights ago and told him about her mother. She was not visibly shaking, but her breathing was wrong, slightly too controlled, the way breathing got when someone was working very hard to regulate it. "Dr. Mercer," Caruso said from the doorway, with a carefulness in his voice that was unusual for him. "We need to move you. This location is compromised." "I know," she said. She didn't move yet. She was still looking at her counter. "There's a secure location. Give me a minute," she said. He gave her the minute. She spent it standing in her ruined kitchen with the flashlight and whatever internal process she was running that Caruso had neither the right nor the inclination to interrupt. Then she straightened, a physical decision visible in her spine, and said, "I need shoes and my medical bag. Someone will have to come with me to get them." "I'll go," Damien said from behind her. She turned. He was standing in the kitchen doorway, and he looked. She registered this almost clinically, the way she registered physical data. Worse than she'd expected. Moving fast in the dark up a staircase with unhealed thoracic trauma had cost him something. He was holding his left side with one hand in a way that was partly unconscious, partly not. "You're bleeding," she said. "It's minor." "That's not a medical assessment. That's wishful thinking." She moved to him, close enough to put her hand against his side, pressing lightly. He went very still. Not from pain, she thought, but from something else. The specific stillness of someone unaccustomed to being touched by someone who isn't trying to hurt them. "You've torn at least 2 of the deeper stitches." "After," he said. "Before we go anywhere," she said. "I'm not riding in a car for 40 minutes with you bleeding into your shirt." "Evelyn, where are your car keys?" she said to Caruso. "I need 3 minutes, a clean towel, and something to work with." Caruso looked at Damien. Damien looked at Evelyn. "Caruso," he said. "Get her the bag from upstairs." She worked in the beam of a flashlight held by a man named Torres, who stood very still and angled the light exactly where she told him without being asked twice. And she did in 4 minutes what should have taken 15, which was stabilize the bleeding and reclose what she could close with what she had, which was enough to be functional, if not elegant. Damien sat on her kitchen stool and said nothing throughout. When she was done, she stripped off the gloves and looked at him. "We need to talk," she said, "before we go anywhere. In the car. Now." Her voice had something in it that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite the flat clinical register she'd been operating in for the last 20 minutes. It was something between the two. Something raw. "Because someone just tried to burn my house down while I was asleep in it, Mr. Falcone. And you told me 2 days ago you had this handled, and I need to understand right now how badly I've been lied to." He held her gaze. "You weren't lied to," he said. "Don't." The situation changed faster than... "Don't!" she said again, louder. Not shouting. The word had too much weight for shouting. "I closed the clinic. I told people who depend on that clinic that they'd have to wait because I needed to protect them from this. I lied to my hospital. I let your men follow me through my workplace. I sat in this house for a week while my neighbors looked at me like I'd lost my mind. Because you told me it was temporary and it was being handled, and in 2 days it would be over." She stopped, started again. "My house just tried to be a fire." "I know." "Who is it?" she said. Not the operational answer, not "it's being handled." "Who made the decision to come after me tonight?" He looked at her for a long moment. "Rafael Moretti," he said. "My consigliere. For 11 years." She absorbed that. "And he didn't run," Damien said. "I thought he ran. He didn't. He's 12 miles south of here, watching to see if this worked." "And does he know it didn't?" "Not yet." She looked at him in the flashlight-lit wreckage of her kitchen, the smell of smoke still sitting heavy in the air, the scorched counter visible just at the edge of the light, and she said, "What are you going to do?" "Find him," Damien said. "Tonight. And then?" "End it." She breathed out slowly. "I want to understand what that means." "No, you don't." She held his gaze long enough that it became something more than a stare. A reckoning, almost. 2 people measuring each other across a burned kitchen with everything stripped away and nothing left to pretend with. "You're right," she said finally. "I don't." She picked up her medical bag from the floor where Caruso had left it. "Let's go." The convoy moved south 20 minutes later. 3 vehicles, tightly spaced, taking a route that changed twice in response to updates coming through Caruso's earpiece. Evelyn sat in the middle vehicle beside Damien, her bag on the seat between them, and said nothing for the first 10 minutes. He did not try to fill the silence. She had begun to notice that about him, the absence of the compulsive noise-making that most people produced when they were uncomfortable. He was capable of silence in a way that most people simply weren't, and she wasn't sure yet whether that was because he had nothing to fill it with, or because he had too much. "Where are we going?" she said eventually. "Secure building, my people, controlled entry, no connection to any of my public-facing operations." "How long will I need to be there?" He didn't answer immediately, which was its own answer. "Damien." It was the first time she'd used his name without the formal distance of Mr. Falcone, and it happened naturally, without decision. She didn't take it back. "How long?" "Until Moretti is off the board," he said, "and the Cavallo connection is neutralized." The Cavallo family. She'd looked them up during those 5 quiet days of trying to pretend everything was normal. That's not a small thing. No. That's a war. He was quiet. "Is that what this is?" she pressed. "Is that what's already started?" "It's been starting for a long time," he said. "Tonight just removed the pretense." He turned to look at her, and in the moving light from the passing street lamps, his face was doing something she hadn't seen on it before. Not exactly tired, but he seemed constitutionally resistant to looking tired, but a kind of density, like a man carrying something very heavy, very carefully, making sure it didn't spill. "I didn't intend for you to be in the middle of this." "I know you didn't. That's not comfort. I understand that." "No," she agreed. "It isn't." She looked out the window. "What happened to Kevin Tran?" The shift in his expression was small, but she caught it. "The young man from your clinic." "Yes." "He's been located," Damien said. "He's safe. He's an idiot, but he's safe." She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "He had no idea what he was starting," she said. "Most people don't." He paused. "That doesn't change what he started." "What's going to happen to him?" "Nothing. From my people. He's too minor to be worth the complication. Whether the Cavallos feel the same way—" He stopped. "Can you protect him?" He looked at her. "You want me to extend protection to the person who put you in this situation in the first place? He's 22 years old, and he made a stupid decision for probably a few $1,000s, and he has no idea that there's a war being fought over his phone call." She met his eyes steadily. "Yes. I want to know he's not going to end up in an alley somewhere." Something moved through Damien's expression. Not irritation, she didn't think. Something more complicated than that. The look of a man encountering, repeatedly, a set of values so fundamentally different from the ones he'd spent his life operating by that he kept having to recalibrate. "I'll see what I can do," he said. The secure building turned out to be a floor in a commercial high-rise in the South Loop. Not a warehouse, not a bunker, but an actual functioning office floor that happened to have been cleared of its usual occupants, fitted with temporary accommodations and stocked with enough supplies to sustain 15 people for a week. Evelyn's room was a converted conference room with a cot, a clean set of clothes in approximately her size, and an attached bathroom. It was, she noted, considerably cleaner and better organized than any safe house she'd ever seen in a movie. She said so to Caruso, who allowed himself a very small smile. She slept for 4 hours. She woke at 6 a.m. to the sound of voices in the outer room, not arguing, but tight and compressed in the way of people discussing something with urgency. She put her feet on the floor and listened. She could hear Damien's voice, lower than the others, asking questions she couldn't make out. She could hear responses that were short and clipped. She could hear a third voice that she didn't recognize. Then she heard a word she did recognize. Her name. She stood up, crossed the room, and opened the door. 4 men were gathered around a table covered in printed documents and a laptop showing what looked like surveillance images. Damien was standing with his back to her, but the other 3 saw her, and the quality of the room changed. Not hostility, but the particular shift of people who were not expecting to have their conversation witnessed. Damien turned. He looked like he hadn't slept at all, which she was fairly certain was accurate. He also looked like something had happened in the last 4 hours that had moved the lines considerably. "There's coffee," he said, which was not what she'd expected him to say. "What's happened?" she said. He glanced at the men around the table. One of them, older, gray at the temples, with the look of someone who managed information for a living, made a small movement toward the documents on the table. Damien either saw it or anticipated it, because he said, "Give us a minute." They filed out without question. When the door closed, Damien pulled out a chair at the table. "Sit down," he said. She didn't like the sound of that. She sat. He turned the laptop toward her. The image on the screen was a surveillance photograph. The grain and angle of a camera that was used to watching parking lots and loading bays rather than anything more interesting. It showed three men standing beside a car. The timestamp in the corner read 4:47 a.m., less than 2 hours ago. She recognized one of them, not from her life, from a photograph she'd pulled up on her phone during those 5 research-heavy evenings of trying to understand what she'd walked into. A face she'd connected to, a name she'd connected to, a structure that she now understood had been systematically dismantling everything Damian Falcone had built for 18 months. Rafael Moretti. He was standing at what appeared to be the loading entrance of a large building, talking to the 2 men beside him. He was animated in the way of someone explaining something urgently. His hands were moving. "This is from 20 minutes ago," Damian said. "You found him." "He found us." He reached past her and clicked to the next image. The building exterior, wider shot. She looked at it for a moment before she understood what she was looking at, and when she did, her stomach turned over once, deliberately, like something shifting its weight. She knew that building. Not personally, but the signage visible at the corner of the image was from a street she knew, a neighborhood she knew, because she had been to that neighborhood twice a month for 2 years. "That's 2 blocks from the clinic," she said. "Yes. He's at the clinic." He's been there for the last 3 hours, Damian said. "My people tracked him there, but were ordered to hold position. I didn't want to move on him until I knew why he chose that location." She looked at the image. "He knows," she said slowly. "About the clinic. Everything about it. If he's been inside your organization for 18 months, he knows I volunteer there. He knows where it is. He knows what it means to me." She looked up at Damian. "He's not hiding. He's bait." The word landed in the room and sat there. "He wants you to come to him," she said. "At the clinic. On his ground, on his terms, with the Cavallo people surrounding the building and every advantage on his side." Damian held her gaze. "Yes," he said. "And he knows you'll come," she said, "because the clinic matters to me, and I matter to—" She stopped, recalibrated. "He knows the clinic is the one place you'll go to directly instead of sending people, because it's personal." The silence between them was very full. "There's something else," Damian said. He reached past her and brought up a third image. This one was not surveillance footage. It was a document. A screenshot of something, a communication chain, and at the top of it was a name she recognized because it was her own, and below it were details that made the air in the room feel suddenly thin. Patient records. Incomplete, fragmentary, sourced from something that wasn't the clinic. The clinic kept no digital records. That was one of its foundational protections, but detailed enough, assembled from enough peripheral sources to construct a picture. Not a medical picture. A leverage picture. Names of people she had treated. People whose presence in an underground clinic would, if exposed, cause consequences that ranged from severe to life-destroying depending on the individual circumstances. "He's going to use them," she said. It wasn't a question. "If this reaches him and he decides he needs a reason, you'll cooperate," Damian said. "Or a reason I'll expose myself, or both." She sat very still. The list was not long. 20 names, maybe 25. But each name was a person. A man with a necrotic foot who couldn't afford insulin. A teenage girl with a dislocated shoulder and bruising she wasn't ready to talk about. 2 kids with ear infections. A middle-aged woman with a hernia that needed a referral. People who had come to the back door of a building on the corner of 49th and Racine because they had nowhere else to go and had trusted absolutely and completely that the information they gave in that room would stay in that room. "How did he get this?" she said. Her voice was flat in a way she was managing carefully. "We're still tracing it. The baseline data is public record. Fragments from insurance databases, pharmacy records, things that individually mean nothing but in aggregate. How long would I have before he used it?" Damian was quiet. "Damian." She turned to face him directly. "How long before he sends that list somewhere it destroys those people's lives?" "If he decides we're not coming to him," Damian said, "probably before morning." She looked at the list on the screen. She looked at it for a long time. Then she did something Damian did not expect. She reached past him, closed the laptop, stood up, and walked to the window. The South Loop at 6 in the morning was gray and beginning to move. Early traffic, the first delivery trucks, the sky doing its daily reluctant business of becoming light. She stood with her back to him, and she made whatever calculation she was making in the privacy of her own mind. And when she turned back around, her face had settled into something he hadn't seen on her before. Not fear, not anger. The specific and terrifying calm of someone who has just decided that the version of themselves that was trying to stay out of this is gone, and what remains is the version that finishes things. "I want to know everything," she said. "Not the summary, not what you think I need to know, everything. The clinic layout, whereas people are positioned, what you have and what you don't have, what the realistic options are, and what the cost of each one is." "Evelyn, I'm going to the clinic," she said, "with or without you, so you can spend the next 10 minutes arguing with me about it. Or you can spend them briefing me. And I'd strongly suggest the second one because, unlike the first, it might actually keep both of us alive." He stared at her. This woman who had been, 10 days ago, a physician with a secret volunteer practice and a quiet house on a street with dead streetlights and a coffee mug with a medical journal next to it, who had knelt in a wet alley and made a decision that had detonated every ordinary thing about her life, who was now standing in a safe house conference room at 6 in the morning with smoke still faintly in her hair, telling him she was going to walk back into the building where this had started. He had, in his life, given orders to men who would walk into any situation he designated without hesitation, because that was the architecture of what he'd built and who those men were. He had never once encountered someone who arrived at that same willingness from a completely opposite direction, not because they were built for it, not because they'd been shaped by years of discipline and consequence, but because they had done a simple moral calculation and landed on the side of the people on that list, and that was simply the end of the conversation for them. He pulled out the tactical map. "His people have the south entrance and the east alley covered," he said. "There are 3 of them inside the building, based on heat signature from a drone pass at 0500. Raphael is in the main treatment room." He spread the map on the table. "The north access through the parking structure of the apartment building next door is currently unwatched, which may mean it's unwatched, or may mean they want us to think it is." She leaned over the map. Her hair fell forward and she pushed it back with one hand, and her eyes moved across the map with the same quick clinical focus she'd used reading his wounds in that alley, the same economy of attention that missed nothing and wasted none of itself on things that didn't matter. "The utility corridor," she said, pointing, "between the clinic basement and the old boiler room. Does that still connect to the street-level grate on Racine?" He looked at her. "You know this building better than my people do," he said. "I've worked there for 2 years in the dark," she said. "Yes or no?" "Yes," he said. "As of 48 hours ago, yes." She straightened up. "Then here's what we're going to do," she said, and the voice she said it in was the same voice she'd used in that alley, the one that had cut through Marcus's panic and Delia's fear and the rain and the blood and all of it, the voice that simply meant the decision has been made and here's what happens next. Damien Falcone listened, and for the first time in 11 years, he let someone else run the plan. The utility grate on Racine Street had not been designed to be opened quietly. Evelyn knew this. She'd used it exactly once before, 18 months ago, when Sandra had locked herself out of the building and they'd spent 40 minutes in the cold figuring out the alternate entry points. The grate was old iron, the hinges were corroded, and it made a sound when you moved it that she could only describe as the architectural equivalent of a clearing throat. She pulled it open anyway, slowly, with both hands, distributing the movement across 4 full seconds instead of 1. The sound it made was bad, but survivable. She went down first. Damien had argued this point for 6 minutes back at the safe house, and she had won it on logic rather than sentiment. She knew the corridor, she knew the layout, she knew exactly which section of concrete floor had a drainage lip that would catch your foot in the dark, and which section was clear. He knew none of that. Therefore she went first, and he followed, and Caruso came third with 2 men behind him, all of them moving in the specific pressurized silence of people who understand that sound is the variable most likely to kill them in the next 20 minutes. The utility corridor was narrow, shoulder width at its widest point, with overhead pipes close enough that a tall man had to tilt his head. It smelled of old water and the particular mineral cold of spaces that never saw sunlight. The only light was the thin beam of the penlight Evelyn held with her teeth while she moved, leaving both hands free. She counted her steps. She'd counted them that night 18 months ago, standing in the cold with Sandra and feeling slightly absurd. 22 steps to the first junction, 12 more to the basement access door. She counted now. At step 19, she stopped. She held up her left hand, a signal she'd agreed on with Caruso. Everyone behind her stopped. She listened. Footsteps above her, moving with the deliberate, even cadence of a man walking a pattern. Not pacing nervously, not moving towards something, but completing a circuit. Security sweep, approximately 8 feet above her head, which put him somewhere in the front section of the clinic's ground floor. She waited. The cadence moved away, faded. She went forward. The basement access door had a padlock that Sandra had given her the combination to 2 years ago, and which, to her knowledge, Sandra had never changed. She worked it in the dark by feel, the metal cold enough to ache against her fingertips, and she got it right on the first try, which she allowed herself exactly 1 second of relief about before she eased the door open and moved into the basement. The basement of the clinic was storage and utility, shelving units with medical supplies in varying states of organization, a secondary water heater that hadn't worked in a year, the folding tables they used when patient volume exceeded the main floor's capacity. It was dark except for the emergency exit sign above the staircase at the far end, which threw everything in low red. She turned off the pen light. Damien came through the door behind her, then Caruso, then the other two. The door closed. 5 people breathing in a red-lit basement that smelled of industrial cleaner and old linoleum. Caruso moved to her left and put his mouth close to her ear. Heat signatures put Moretti in the main treatment room. I know where it is, she breathed back. 2 of his people are between us and the staircase. 3rd is on the ground floor front. The one I heard. Yes. She looked at the staircase across the length of the basement. 20 feet of open floor between them and the bottom step. The red from the exit sign was enough to see by if you were already adapted to the dark, which everyone in the room was. It was also enough to be seen by. She turned to Damien. In the red dark, his face was stripped of most of its readable detail. Just angles and shadow and the eyes, which were doing what she was coming to recognize as his operational state. Everything internal turned down. Everything external turned up. A quality of attention so absolute it was almost physical. She held up 2 fingers, pointed upward, pointed left and right of the staircase. He nodded. He understood. She pointed at herself, pointed straight up. He did not like this. She could see it in the quality of his stillness, but it was a different stillness from his operational state, a stillness with something working hard underneath it. She held his gaze. He nodded. She went up the stairs. The ground floor of the clinic in the dark and unoccupied was profoundly strange. She had only ever been here with people in it. The particular organized chaos of a volunteer medical operation, voices and the smell of antiseptic and Sandra's bad coffee and the sounds of patients. Empty, in the dark, it had the quality of a space between states, a held breath. She came off the staircase into the back corridor and immediately felt the change in air temperature. Warmer up here, and the smell of something that shouldn't be here, that didn't belong to this building. Cologne, heavy and expensive. Rafael Moretti had been in these rooms for 3 hours and had left his presence on the air like a fingerprint. The treatment room was at the end of the corridor. The door was partially open. Light. Not the red of the exit sign, but actual warm light. A lamp, or a lantern, spilling in a thin line across the corridor floor. She moved toward it. Her feet were quiet in the sneakers Caruso's man had brought her. She counted her breaths without deciding to. 2 in, 2 out. The same rhythm she used when she was doing something delicate. A difficult intubation, a procedure requiring more precision than the situation should technically allow. The rhythm meant, "You are steady, act accordingly." She stopped at the door. Through the gap she could see the edge of the examination table she'd used 100 times. The lamp, an LED camping lantern set on the counter, throwing the room in flat white. And a man sitting in the chair she always kept in the corner, the chair for patients' family members, the chair that existed specifically to say to frightened people, "Someone who loves you can stay." Rafael Moretti was 60 years old and looked, in the ungenerous light of the lantern, like a man who had spent those 60 years making calculations and was currently running the numbers on his current situation and finding them not entirely satisfactory. He was not holding a weapon visibly. He was sitting with his hands loose on his knees, a phone face up on the table beside him, and the particular composed quality of someone who has decided that composure is the only position still available to them. He was also not alone. There was a man she hadn't anticipated, standing in the part of the room the heat signature analysis hadn't covered because it was directly adjacent to the exterior wall, a cold spot that had read as empty. He was standing with his back to the room's only window, arms crossed, watching the door. He saw her the same moment she registered him. She did not run. She did not freeze. She pushed the door open and walked into the room because the only thing running backward accomplished at this point was getting shot in the back. And she had decided, in the basement, that the version of her that was afraid of these men was a luxury she couldn't currently afford. "Dr. Mercer," Raphael said. He didn't sound surprised. She noted that. "Mr. Moretti," she said, "I was wondering which entry point you'd use." He tilted his head slightly. "The corridor, of course. Sandra Kowalski's building. You know it very well." "Better than you," she said. He smiled. It was the smile of a man who had spent decades in rooms with people who believed that knowing a thing gave them an advantage, and who knew that the advantage depended entirely on what the other person knew that you didn't. "Perhaps," he said. "Sit down, please." "I'd rather stand." "As you like." He glanced at the man by the window, a glance that communicated something Evelyn cataloged without being able to fully decode. "I want to be very clear with you, Doctor. I have no desire to harm you. You are, at this point, more useful to me alive and cooperative than any alternative." "That's not as reassuring as you seem to think it is." "Where is Damien?" "Not here." "That's not true." She looked at him steadily. "What do you want?" "What I've always wanted," Raphael said. "A clean resolution. Damien is a talented man, but he has become a liability to the larger operation. His unwillingness to modernize, to form necessary alliances, to understand that the old structure is no longer viable. I spent 18 months building toward a transition that would have been orderly, controlled, and frankly better for everyone, including most of Damien's own people." He paused. "You complicated things. I treated a patient. You kept him alive." The first edge in his voice, thin as a paper cut, but there. "Do you understand what that night cost me? 18 months of positioning, the Cavallo agreement, the internal consensus I'd spent a year building, everything contingent on Damien not surviving that alley." He leaned forward slightly. "And then an anonymous doctor with a conscience decided to play hero." She said nothing. "I don't blame you," he continued, pulling back. "You didn't know. You couldn't have. But you are now, whether you chose it or not, the single most inconvenient piece of evidence in a case that I am trying very hard to close." He picked up the phone from the table beside him. "The patient records I've assembled, the names, the people whose trust you hold." He looked at the phone for a moment, then back at her. "I have a number ready to send this to. Immigration enforcement, several journalists, one prosecutor who has been looking for a reason to examine your clinic's operation for 2 years. It goes in the next..." He checked his watch. 8 minutes, unless I make a different decision." Her hands, at her sides, were still. "Unless," she said, "unless Damien walks through that door in the next 3 minutes, alone. And we have a conversation that ends with an agreement instead of a war." He set the phone back on the table with a small, definitive sound. "I'm not a monster, Dr. Mercer. I'm a businessman. Monsters destroy things. I want to own them." She breathed in. She breathed out. "He's not going to make an agreement with you," she said. "No," Raphael agreed. "He's not. But you're going to ask him to." He looked at her with something that was almost gentle in its certainty. "Because those names on that list are yours to protect. And that's the only thing in this room you actually care about." She stared at him. The man by the window shifted his weight, and then the window behind him exploded inward. It happened very fast and very loud. The specific implosive violence of glass under sudden pressure, followed immediately by the sounds of the rear corridor, which was no longer silent. The man by the window went down in a cascade of glass, and the controlled chaos of Caruso's people moving through a space they'd entered from three separate directions simultaneously, while she was in this room drawing Raphael's complete attention away from every other point of entry. She dropped. Not panicking. Deliberate, trained seeming even though no one had trained her for this. Simply the correct response to a room that was suddenly full of unpredictable moving bodies, and she was the only one who knew for certain she wasn't the threat. She hit the floor behind the examination table and put her hands over her head and stayed there. The room was extremely loud for 11 seconds. Then it was quiet. She raised her head. Raphael Moretti was still in the chair. He had not moved. Not from bravery, she thought, but from the calculation of a man who understood that movement in this moment was more likely to get him shot than staying still. His hands were raised to shoulder height, and his composure had survived mostly intact with only its surface scratched, like expensive furniture that had been knocked but not broken. Caruso was at his left with two men she recognized from the safe house. Damien was at his right, and Damien's face was something she didn't have a previous reference for. She had seen him in pain, in crisis, in the particular focused cold of operational mode. She had not seen him in the presence of the specific man who had spent 18 months building his death, and whose presence in this room, this building, this place that was Evelyn's, had apparently produced something older and darker and more fundamental than operational mode. "The phone," Damien said. His voice was entirely level, which somehow made it worse. Raphael looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "You can't close this, Damien. The Cavallos—" "The phone, Raphael, have been in communication with 3 of your captains for the last 6 weeks. You take me off the board and you think that solves your problem, but you still have—" "I know about the captains." Damien moved to the table and picked up the phone himself. He looked at the screen, at the message prepared and ready. He looked at it for exactly 2 seconds. Then he put it in his pocket. "I know about the captains. I know about the Cavallo financial structure, the shell accounts, the airfield, the prosecutor you've been feeding documents to for 9 months. I know about all of it, Raphael." Raphael was quiet. 18 months, he said finally. "Yes." "And you knew?" Damien looked at him. "I suspected. 3 months ago, I knew." The calculation that moved across Raphael's face in the aftermath of that statement was visible even from where Evelyn was slowly getting to her feet behind the examination table. It was the calculation of a man reorganizing a fundamental assumption, realizing that the ground he'd believed himself to be standing on had been rearranged beneath him, and determining how long ago. "Then why—" he started. "Because I needed everything," Damien said. "Not the suspicion, not the theory, the proof, the financial records, the communication chain, the Cavallo connection, the names of every person you brought into this over 18 months. I needed all of it before I moved, because moving early would have burned the evidence, scattered the participants, and left me with nothing provable." He paused. "You taught me that, actually. Patience as a weapon." Raphael laughed. It was a short, humorless sound. "You're going to have me arrested. I'm going to hand you to the federal authorities along with documentation of every crime you've committed in the last 18 months, plus whatever they can use from before that. Which is quite a lot." Damien's voice stayed level throughout. "This isn't a war, Raphael. Wars are messy and expensive and generate the kind of attention that's bad for everyone. This is an ending, and the ending is the one where you spend whatever you have left in a federal correctional facility, and the Cavallo operation collapses under the weight of the financial documentation I'm going to send to the FBI's Organized Crime Division before noon." Raphael looked at him. "That's very clean," he said. "I'm tired of things that aren't," Damien said. There was a sound from the corridor then, a scuffle, brief and decisive, followed by voices and the short-clipped register of Caruso's men managing a situation. 2 of the Cavallo mercenaries who had been stationed in the building finally cornered. No shots. Evelyn noticed that. No shots. She was on her feet now, standing beside the examination table, and she was doing what she always did in the aftermath of a crisis. Her eyes moving across the room, cataloging, assessing. The man who had come through the window was on the floor and not moving but breathing, which she could see from the rise and fall of his chest. The 2 men Caruso had brought through the rear corridor were standing upright, functional. Caruso himself had a cut across his forearm from the window glass that would need attention but wasn't serious. Damien was standing in front of Rafael Moretti, and she looked at him more carefully. He was holding himself in a way that wasn't right, the same compensation she'd seen earlier, but more pronounced now. His weight distributed slightly wrong, the left side carrying less than it should be. She'd restitched him in her kitchen 4 hours ago, and he had run and fought and come through a window in the last 20 minutes, and the math on that was not good. "You're bleeding again," she said. Every head in the room turned to her, which she ignored. Damien turned to her. "I'm fine," he said. "You've said that before and been wrong," she said. She crossed the room toward him. "Let me see." "Evelyn, right now, or I will make a scene in front of all these people." She stopped in front of him and looked up at his face, which was doing that thing again. Not quite resistant, not quite cooperating. A man unaccustomed to being managed, encountering someone with absolutely no interest in his preferences about it. "Sit down." She looked at Caruso. "Is this building secure?" Caruso took exactly 1 second to reassess what was happening. "Yes, ma'am." "Then find me whatever medical supplies are left in this building. There should be a kit in the bottom cabinet of the back room, gray bag, red zipper. Go." Caruso went. She looked back at Damien. He sat down. In the chair Raphael had just vacated, which she found in some distant compartment of her mind that was still tracking the ironic, somewhat appropriate. She reached for his jacket. He caught her wrist. Not hard. Just a contact, a stop, with enough weight to mean something. She looked at him. "Thank you," he said, very quietly. With the specific quality of a man who doesn't say those 2 words often and means them with the full weight of everything he doesn't say. She looked at him for a moment. "You can thank me after I make sure you're not bleeding internally," she said. She opened his jacket. It was worse than she'd hoped and better than she'd feared. The stitches at the upper wound site had held, but the lower ones had pulled entirely free, and the incision had opened in a way that was ugly and needed attention but was not, thank everything in her training, threatening anything vital. She pressed her palm against it. He made a sound that was almost not a sound, a barely audible exhale through his teeth that cost him more to suppress than it should have, which told her exactly how much everything was hurting and how long he'd been pushing through it. "Hold this," she said, guiding his hand to the pressure point. He took over without being told how hard. "Good." She looked around the room. Raphael was now standing between 2 of Caruso's men, his hands zip-tied, his composure finally showing its first real crack. Not fear exactly, but the specific pallor of a man whose plan has just comprehensively failed and who is running the arithmetic on what comes next. On the floor of the clinic where she had spent 2 years treating people who had nowhere else to go. She thought about the list on his phone. 23 names she had in her head. 23 people who had trusted her with things they couldn't trust anyone else with. She looked at Damien. "The phone," she said. He reached into his pocket and handed it to her without question. She looked at the prepared message, the list, the phone numbers for the recipients he'd assembled. She deleted the message. Then she held down the power button until the phone died. She handed it back. "That's not evidence of anything important," she said, "so we don't need it." He looked at her. Something in his eyes that she was going to spend a long time not thinking about until she was somewhere quiet and could afford to. Caruso came back with the medical kit. She took it. "Caruso," she said, opening the bag and beginning to sort through it with the efficiency of someone who has done this in inadequate conditions more times than she can count, "I need light." He produced a flashlight and held it exactly where she needed it. She worked. Outside, the city was beginning its morning. She could hear it at the edges. The first elevated train rattling through on the tracks 2 blocks north, the ambient noise of a neighborhood reclaiming its ordinary rhythm from the dark. Inside the clinic, Rafael Moretti sat in the back of Caruso's car, waiting for the men who would transport him somewhere Damien had arranged, which she understood was a controlled handoff and did not ask about. Inside the clinic, 2 of Caruso's men moved through the building methodically, and the sounds they produced were the sounds of a space being secured and cleared rather than threatened. Inside the clinic, the examination room lamp threw its flat white light over the counter and the cabinets and the chair, where a man who should have been in a hospital bed was sitting while a woman who should have been home sleeping worked on him with thread and a focus that left no room for anything else. She tied off the last suture. She pressed a clean dressing over the site and held it. "This is the last time I do this in a building without proper equipment," she said. "Next time you get shot or stabbed or blown through a window." "I wasn't blown through a window, Caruso's people. I don't care what the technical mechanism was. Next time anything happens to you in proximity to my presence, we are in a hospital with a surgical team and anesthesia, and I am not the one holding the needle." She pressed the adhesive edges of the dressing down with more force than was strictly necessary. "Are we clear?" "We're clear," he said. She looked up at him. He was looking at her with that expression she didn't have words for, the one that had been appearing more frequently over the last week. The look of a man encountering something he hadn't built a category for and was quietly, privately, rebuilding his architecture around. "Damien," she said. "Yes." "The captains, the three you said Cavallo had been communicating with." She held his gaze. "What happens to them?" He was quiet. "Damien, they'll have the opportunity to make a decision," he said carefully. "That's not an answer. The most honest answer I have right now." He paused. "I don't want more casualties. I'm not—" He stopped, started differently. "The version of this that ends in blood, in war, in the kind of response my organization is capable of, I know how to do that. I've always known how to do that. It is not anymore the version I want." She looked at him. "Because of tonight?" she said. "Because of 10 days ago," he said, "in an alley, when someone made a different choice." The room was very quiet. From somewhere in the building came the sound of Caruso's voice, giving orders in the low, rapid register of a man managing logistics. Doors, movement, the ordinary sounds of a situation resolving itself into its aftermath. She pressed her hand flat against the dressing one more time, a check, a confirmation that it was holding, and then she sat back on her heels and looked at the work she'd done. It would hold. It wasn't elegant. None of this had been elegant, but it would hold, and holding was what mattered. She started packing the kit. Her hands were not shaking, which she noted with the same clinical detachment she noted everything else, and which she knew was adrenaline and would stop being true in about 40 minutes when the adrenaline ran out and everything that had happened in the last 6 hours caught up with her body all at once. She would deal with that later. "Caruso is going to want to move us soon," Damien said. "I know. The federal contact needs to happen before 7 a.m. for the timing to work on the Cavallo documentation. I understand." "Evelyn." She zipped the kit. She looked at him. He was still sitting in the chair, in the flat white lamplight, in the building on the corner of 49th and Racine, where she had spent 2 years treating people who had nowhere else to go. And he looked like a man who had something to say, and was finding that the machinery he'd built over decades for exactly this kind of moment, the moment requiring precision and control and the careful management of what you allowed the world to see, was not quite working the way it used to. He sat in that chair in the flat white lamplight, and he looked at her and he said, "I don't know how to do this part." She stopped moving. "Which part?" she said. "The part where it's over." He looked down at his hands for a moment, the hands she'd come to know as a kind of index to his internal state, usually very still, currently not quite. "I know how to build things. I know how to protect them. I know how to dismantle what threatens them. I have spent my entire adult life becoming very good at those 3 things." He looked back up at her. "I don't know how to sit in a room after and figure out what comes next when what comes next isn't another problem." She looked at him for a long time. Then she picked up the medical kit, stood, and said, "One thing at a time. Right now the next thing is getting you somewhere you can actually rest without tearing those stitches again. Everything else is after that." He nodded slowly. He stood. Carefully, with the cautious economy of a man who had learned, finally and at significant cost, that his body had limits it was going to enforce with or without his cooperation. "One thing at a time," he repeated, like he was testing whether the principle worked as a general operating philosophy. It's how I've gotten through everything, she said. Highly recommend it. Caruso appeared in the doorway with the particular timing of a man who had been waiting for exactly the right moment, which told her he'd been listening, which she decided to address at some other point when it mattered more. Car's ready, Caruso said. Federal contact is standing by for 7. Damien looked at him. Raphael is secured? En route. The 3 captains. Caruso's expression shifted slightly. 2 of them came in voluntarily when they heard we had Raphael. The 3rd is being located. When he's located, bring him to me, not to anyone else. To me. Understood. Damien moved toward the door. He stopped beside her. Coming? He said. I need a minute, she said. I'll be right out. He looked at her once, a look that was brief and complete, and carried more in it than most conversations. And then he went. She stood alone in the examination room. The lamp was still on. The room smelled of antiseptic and smoke and the particular chemical aftermath of a space that had been through something and was now returning to itself. She looked at the examination table, the counter where the incendiary device had scorched the surface of her clinic, the cabinet where the medical kit had lived, where it had always lived, where she had reached for it 100 times for 100 patients. She thought about the 57-year-old man with the necrotic foot, the girl with the dislocated shoulder, the 2 kids with ear infections, the 23 people on a list that now existed only in her memory because she had deleted the only other copy. She thought about a stranger in an alley in the rain. She turned off the lamp. She walked out. The federal handoff happened at 6:58 a.m. in a parking structure in the West Loop, which Evelyn was not present for and did not ask about in detail. What she knew was that Damien spent 40 minutes on the phone between the clinic and the parking structure, and that the documentation Jin had compiled went to 3 separate federal investigators simultaneously, and that by 8 a.m. Raphael Moretti was in federal custody, and the machinery of a prosecution that had been 18 months in the assembling was beginning to turn. She knew these things because Caruso told her in the spare and factual way that Caruso communicated information, while she sat in the back of the middle vehicle in a 3-car convoy heading north. She did not feel triumphant. She wasn't sure she'd expected to. What she felt was the specific hollowness of someone who has been running on adrenaline for an extended period and has just felt it leave. Like the tide going out very suddenly and leaving everything on the ground exposed, her own fatigue, her own fear, all the things she'd been managing so carefully for 10 days that had never stopped being present, only been put somewhere workable. She looked out the window. Chicago coming awake in the early morning was one of her actual favorite things about this city, and she hadn't been able to appreciate it for 10 days. The bakeries with their lights on, the dog walkers, the man in the blue jacket who ran the same route through Lincoln Park every morning at this hour and whom she'd seen from her car approximately 300 times without ever knowing his name. The specific quality of October light on the lake, when you could catch a glimpse of it between buildings, gray-blue and very large and indifferent in the way that large bodies of water were always indifferent, which she found, right now, extraordinarily comforting. None of this cared what had happened in the last 10 days. The lake had been doing what it did before she was born and would keep doing it after, and there was something in that she needed right now more than almost anything else. They took her home, or what was left of it. The house in Rogers Park had been assessed by 2 of Caruso's people while they were at the clinic, and the verdict was structurally sound, smoke damage to the kitchen manageable, the security breach point secured, which meant she could go home, which meant she stood on her front porch at 7:30 in the morning and put her key in her own lock and walked into her own hallway. It smelled of smoke, not overwhelmingly. The windows had been open, she could tell, but the underneath smell was still there, the reminder. She stood in the hallway. She was still standing there when her phone rang. Sandra. She answered. "Tell me everything," Sandra said, "starting from the part where you're alive and ending with the part where you're alive." "I'm alive," Evelyn said. "That's the best and worst summary I've ever heard. Are you home?" "Yes." "I'm coming over." "Sandra, you don't have to say—" "I'm already in my car," Sandra said. "Put on coffee, not the good stuff, the bad stuff, because I need it to taste like the clinic, or I'm going to cry, and I can't drive and cry." She put on the bad coffee. Sandra arrived in 19 minutes, and the first thing she did was walk through every room of the house in a thorough and systematic way that had nothing to do with assessing damage and everything to do with the specific ritual of a person who loves someone, making sure the physical space is real and intact. Then she sat down at the kitchen table, looked at the scorched counter, and said, "Tell me." Evelyn told her. All of it. The 10 days, the safe house, the clinic, Raphael, the list. She told her plainly and without editorial, the way she presented cases at Northwestern. Here are the facts, here's the progression, here's the outcome. Sandra listened without interrupting, which was not natural for Sandra and was therefore an act of significant discipline. When Evelyn finished, Sandra was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "The list, the names." "Gone," Evelyn said. "The only copy that existed." Sandra breathed out. "All of them." "All of them." Another silence. "And Kevin," Sandra said, "safe. Damien," she paused over the name, using it so naturally now that she noticed the noticing. "He made arrangements. Kevin is being relocated. A cousin in Milwaukee, I think. He's not coming back to Chicago." "He shouldn't," Sandra said. Not unkindly. The voice of someone who understood the difference between stupidity and malice, and could hold both accountable simultaneously. "No," Evelyn agreed. Sandra picked up her coffee, drank, made the expression she always made, which was the expression of someone who had decided that bad coffee was a character-building exercise and was committed to the curriculum. "The clinic," she said. 2 weeks, Evelyn said. "Maybe 3 to let things settle. Then we reopen." Sandra looked at her. "What about the next time?" she said. "Not this exact situation, but the next time someone walks in with something we're not equipped for, or someone uses our patience to leverage us, or—" "I've been thinking about that," Evelyn said. "And?" She looked at her coffee. "There may be a way to operate legally, transparently. A charitable medical foundation with independent oversight, proper licensing, actual equipment, somewhere between the underground and the mainstream that doesn't require us to exist in the shadows and doesn't require patients to be invisible to receive care." Sandra was very still. "That's not a small thing." "No. The funding alone would require—" "I know." "Evelyn," Sandra set her coffee down, "does this have anything to do with the man whose soldiers surrounded your house 10 days ago?" She met Sandra's eyes. "It might," she said. "Is that a problem?" Sandra thought about it for what felt like a genuine amount of time. "Ask me again in 6 months," she said, "when I can see what that looks like in practice." "Fair enough." Sandra left at 10. Evelyn slept for 6 hours, which was not enough, and was also the best sleep she'd had in 2 weeks. She woke at 4 in the afternoon to 3 missed calls from the hospital, one from her department chief, and one from a number she didn't recognize that turned out to be a federal investigator who wanted to take a statement about the events at the clinic on Racine. She scheduled the statement for 2 days out. She called her department chief and said she'd be back Thursday. She showered for a long time and stood in the steam and let her body have the rest it had been demanding. The weeks that followed were quiet in the specific way of an aftermath. Not peaceful exactly, but the comparative stillness of things no longer being actively on fire. Raphael Moretti's indictment was announced 11 days after his arrest. Evelyn read about it in the Tribune, sitting at her kitchen table with the window open to October air, the coffee good this time, because she'd bought the good kind specifically. The article was careful and thorough and contained nothing she didn't already know, but she read it to the end anyway. The Cavallo family's financial operation collapsed under the weight of the documentation that had been submitted to federal investigators. 3 senior members were indicted within 6 weeks. The family's ability to operate in Chicago was, by November, severely compromised. Not gone, these things were never gone, but diminished in ways that had real and visible consequences. The 3rd captain, the one who had not come in voluntarily, was found by Caruso's people at a motel in Gary, Indiana, and brought to Damien, as ordered. What happened in that conversation, Evelyn did not know. What she knew was that the man subsequently turned himself in to federal authorities with a full account of his communications with the Cavallo operation, which was either a conversion experience or a very practical calculation. Possibly both. She saw Damien twice in October, briefly and functionally, once when his wound needed checking, and once when there was documentation for the charitable foundation that required her review and signature. Both times they met in a conference room in his legitimate business office downtown, with other people present, and the conversations were specific and contained. She noticed that he was moving more easily, the left side carrying its proper weight again. She noticed it the way she noticed all physical data, automatically, without meaning to. The third time she saw him in October, there were no other people present. He appeared at her door on a Thursday evening in late October. No convoy, no security detail visible, though she'd learned by now they were never entirely absent. Just Damien Falcone on her front porch with a jacket that had not been measured for him this time. A regular jacket, slightly less expensive than the destroyed one, worn in at the elbows. And 2 cups of coffee from the place on Clark Street that she went to every Saturday morning and that he had clearly looked up. He held one out. She took it. "You could have called," she said. "I could have," he agreed. She stepped aside. He came in. They sat at the kitchen table. Her kitchen, which smelled of fresh paint now because she'd repainted the scorched section herself one Sunday afternoon, badly enough that Sandra had offered to help, and she had refused on principle. The counter was slightly uneven in the way of a patch job done by someone whose skill set was in entirely other areas. She'd decided to leave it that way. "The foundation paperwork cleared," Damien said. "The licensing process will take 3 to 4 months, but the funding is in place." "I know, Sandra has been updating me. She's very efficient." "She's terrifying," Evelyn said, "in the best possible way." Something moved across his face that was almost a smile. "The Independent Oversight Board," she said. "I want to be clear about what that means in practice. No operational input from your organization, no pressure on patient selection, no access to records, no knowledge of who we treat or how. Completely separate." "Agreed." "I mean it, Damien." "I know you mean it," he said. "That's why I agreed." She looked at him. "How are you?" she said. Not medical. Actually asking. He considered the question with the seriousness it apparently required, which she'd noticed was how he treated most questions. Not performing thoughtfulness, actually doing it. "Strange," he said finally. "The organization is restructuring. The operations that were the primary source of what created all of this." He paused. "Those are being wound down. The legitimate businesses are expanding. It's a slower process than I'd like and considerably more complicated than it sounds." "Is it working?" "Ask me in a year," she nodded. "Your people," she said. "The ones who were hurt. Martinez?" "Recovered. He's back on rotation. Caruso's arm. He said to tell you the scar is distinguished." She almost smiled. "Tell him the scar means he should have gotten it sutured properly when I offered." "I'll pass that along." They drank their coffee. Outside, October was doing what October did. The light failing a little earlier each day, the trees on her street in various stages of their annual unburdening, leaves on the sidewalk in the specific gold and brown palette that always made Chicago feel, briefly, like it was showing you something true about itself before the cold came and covered everything up. "I went back to the clinic," Damien said. She looked at him. "Yesterday," he said. "I wanted to see it. In the daylight, with no one else there." He looked at the table for a moment. "I sat in the examination room for a while." "Why?" He thought about it. "I've been trying to understand," he said, "what it means that the thing that changed the most about my life in the last month happened in a room that exists specifically because the world is failing the people in it." He looked up at her. "You built something in a basement with bad equipment and worse coffee and no resources and no protection and no recognition. You built something real." She was quiet. "I've built things my whole life," he said. "Large things. Things that required significant resources and significant force. And none of them have held up to the same standard as a folding table in a converted auto shop on 49th and Racine." She looked at him for a long moment. "You're being too hard on yourself," she said. "And not hard enough simultaneously, which is a difficult balance to strike." He raised an eyebrow. "What you built was real too," she said. "The part that protected people who needed protecting. The part that held things together through transitions that would have been worse without you. That's real." She held his gaze. The rest of it, the parts that required the force you're talking about, you already know the accounting on that. You don't need me to run it for you." "No," he said, "I don't." "So what do you need?" He was quiet for a moment, then, "To know if it's possible to be a different kind of real than the kind I've been." She looked at him steadily. "I treated a man in an alley," she said. "That's all I did. I didn't fix his life. I didn't solve what put him there. I didn't make any decisions about what he deserved or didn't deserve. I just kept him alive and let the rest be his." She paused. "You're the one who did the rest." Something in his face changed. Something that had been held very carefully for a very long time shifted fractionally, like a door that had been closed for so long it had become part of the wall, and someone had just found the handle. "Sandra wants to meet with you," she said, "about the foundation board. She has opinions about the oversight structure that she would like to share at length." "I've been warned," he said. "You haven't been adequately warned," she said. "But you will be." He finished his coffee. He set the cup down with the same small, definitive sound she'd heard from him across the kitchen table what felt like a different lifetime ago. He stood. She walked him to the door. On the porch, in the October early dark, he paused. "The morning," he said. 10 days ago. When I came with the men. All of them." "I remember," she said. "I stood at the bottom of your steps." He looked at the steps in question, briefly, as if reorienting. "You were at the window. You didn't step back." "No," she said. "Why not?" She thought about it honestly. "Because stepping back would have meant deciding you were something to be afraid of before I had enough information," she said. "And I've made a career out of not making diagnostic decisions before I have enough information." He looked at her. "And now?" he said. "Enough information?" She leaned against her doorframe and looked out at the street, the dead streetlights that the city had stopped maintaining 3 years ago and still hadn't fixed. The neighbor's porch light across the way, Mr. Hennessy's window, dark now, the man himself almost certainly asleep at an hour that the rest of the neighborhood was only beginning its evening. "Yes," she said. "Enough information." He nodded. Once. He walked down the steps. At the bottom, he paused again without turning around, which was not a habit she'd identified in him before, and which therefore meant something. "The foundation," he said. "If it works the way we're structuring it, if the oversight holds and the licensing clears and it becomes what you're describing, yes. Would you consider not running it? I know you'd never leave Northwestern, but consulting, with final say on the medical structure." She was quiet. "Ask me in 6 months," she said, "when I can see what it looks like in practice." He made a sound that was not quite a laugh, and was not a laugh either. He walked to the car. She watched him go. The months that followed were not a clean resolution. They were instead what actual resolutions look like, complicated and incremental and frequently frustrating and real. The Foundation's licensing took 5 months rather than 3. The independent oversight board included 2 people Sandra found intolerable, and one she adored, which was Sandra's characterization and which Evelyn trusted implicitly. The first properly licensed intake session in the new facility, a ground floor space in Pilsen with actual equipment and proper lighting, and a coffee maker that Sandra selected based on criteria she declined to share, happened in March, on a Tuesday, in the rain. 9 patients. 3 of whom had been coming to the old clinic on 49th and Racine, Warsan. Evelyn was there. She told Northwestern she had a personal appointment, which was not exactly a lie. She treated a man with hypertension who hadn't been able to see a doctor in 2 years, an elderly woman with a respiratory infection that had been developing for 3 weeks, a teenager who needed stitches in his palm from a kitchen accident and who was brought in by his mother because she didn't have insurance and didn't know what else to do. She sutured the teenager's palm with the kind of care that had nothing to do with the simplicity of the injury and everything to do with the practice of attention, the same attention she'd been applying to things in alleys and exam rooms and burned kitchens for the last several months. The boy watched her work with the expression of someone who had expected to be afraid of this and discovered he wasn't. "Does it hurt?" she asked. "A little," he said. It's going to hurt more tomorrow when the local wears off. Keep it clean, keep it dry, come back in 10 days, or if you see any redness spreading from the site before that. Okay, he said. You can bring your mother, she said. She can wait right outside. She's worried, he said. That's what mothers do, Evelyn said. Let her in. She finished the suture. She dressed the wound. She walked the boy to the door where his mother was waiting with the specific contained anxiety of a woman who had been managing without adequate resources for long enough that even a good outcome didn't fully release the tension. He's fine, Evelyn said. Clean wound, good closure. He'll heal without a problem. The woman looked at her. Thank you. Come back in 10 days, Evelyn said. We're here Tuesdays and Thursdays. She went back inside. Sandra was at the intake desk doing the administrative work she'd been doing for 3 years with the same focused efficiency and the same expression of someone who knows exactly how important it is and doesn't need to be told. She looked up when Evelyn came in. Good? She said. Good, Evelyn said. In the supply room at the back of the new facility, there was a shelf with the same gray bag and red zipper that had lived in the bottom cabinet on Racine. Evelyn had brought it herself. It was not the nicest equipment on the shelf. The foundation had bought proper supplies, the kind they'd never been able to afford before. But it was the one she reached for first, out of habit, out of something that wasn't quite sentiment and wasn't not sentiment either. There was a card tucked into the side pocket of the bag. She'd put it there in October and hadn't moved it. One side, a phone number. The other, you saved my life. The least I can do is try not to ruin yours. D. She looked at it for a moment. She put it back. 8 months after a storm-soaked night in October, Damien Falcone came to the clinic on a Tuesday afternoon when the waiting room had 2 people in it and Sandra was on the phone managing a supply delivery with the full force of her personality. He had flowers, which she had not expected. Not elaborate ones, a straightforward bunch from what was clearly a corner store, chosen with the pragmatism of a man who had decided on the gesture and executed it without overthinking the details. He looked different. She'd seen him several times in the intervening months, at foundation meetings, at one necessary legal consultation, once across the room at a Northwestern fundraising event where they had acknowledged each other with the particular nod of people who share a significant amount of context and are in a setting that doesn't accommodate it. But here, in the clinic, without the architecture of business or strategy around him, he looked different, less like a man managing outcomes, more like a man standing in a place that mattered to him and being willing to let that be visible. He held out the flowers. She took them. The man with the foot, he said. The one you mentioned once, the insulin. She looked at him. He's been enrolled in a care management program through the foundation, Damien said. His HbA1c dropped 2 points in 3 months. His doctor says the foot is stable. She stared at him. How do you know that? Sandra sends reports, he said. Aggregate, anonymized, compliant with every applicable regulation. She was very clear about that. Of course she was. I read them, he said simply. She looked at him in the doorway of the clinic, the afternoon light coming through the front windows that actually let in light now, unlike the one small high window above the sink on Racine. The sound of Sandra's voice in the back, managing the delivery with characteristic precision. The smell of the place, antiseptic, coffee, the particular warmth of a heated space in early spring. Come in, she said. He came in. Sandra looked up from the phone, clocked him, clocked the flowers, clocked Evelyn's face, and returned to her phone call with the expression of a woman who had several opinions and had decided that this was not the moment for them. Evelyn put the flowers in the water pitcher they used for exactly this kind of thing. The clinic received flowers occasionally from patients who had nowhere else to put their gratitude, and set it on the counter. The restructuring, she said. How's it going? Slowly, he said, and better than I expected, which I'm told is how these things go. The people who depended on the old structure. Being transitioned, it's not, he stopped. It's not without cost. There are people whose situations are worse in the short term because of decisions I've made. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. Are you doing what you can for them? Yes. Then that's what you can do, she said. He was quiet for a moment. I had a conversation last week, he said, with a man who has been in my organization for 22 years. He's 51. He has a daughter in college. He has spent his entire adult life doing things that he did because they were the structure he was inside, not because they were the things he would have chosen. He paused. I'm trying to figure out what I owe him. She looked at him. What did you tell him? That I was going to help him figure out what came next, that the organization would support that transition. He met her eyes. And then I sat in my office afterward trying to work out whether that's enough. Is it? I don't know, he said. I don't think there's a clean answer. No, she agreed. There usually isn't. Sandra finished her call. The supply delivery arrived. For the next 40 minutes, the clinic was in the particular organized motion of a Tuesday afternoon. Patients arriving, the intake process Sandra had designed and refined and would refine further, the back room where Evelyn saw patients one at a time with the focused attention that was the only thing she'd ever been able to reliably offer in rooms like this. Damien sat in the waiting room. He did not look uncomfortable, which she'd half expected. He sat with the same quality of stillness he'd always had, and he looked at the room, at the people in it, at the walls Sandra had covered with health information in 4 languages, at the children's drawings that a patient had donated as a thank you in February, taped above the intake desk, with the attention of someone who was seeing something they'd had a hand in building and were deciding what they thought about it. After the last patient of the afternoon, she found him still there. You stayed, she said. I didn't have anywhere I needed to be, he said, which she understood from him was not a statement about his schedule. She sat in the chair across from him. The waiting room empty now, Sandra in the back doing closing procedures, the late afternoon light pulling long across the floor. I need to ask you something, she said. Yes. The night in the alley before you left, you folded the blanket. He looked at her. I've been thinking about that for 8 months, she said. Why? He was quiet for a moment. My mother, he said finally, she had a thing about... She believed that the way you left a space was the clearest thing about who you were. Not who you performed being, but who you were. A pause. She died when I was 23. I've been folding blankets since. She sat with that. She would have liked what you're doing here, he said. Tell me about her, Evelyn said. He looked at her with the look she'd first seen across a kitchen table at 2 a.m, the look of a man encountering something he didn't have a category for, still building the architecture. He started talking. Outside, Chicago moved through its evening with the enormous indifference of a city that has seen everything and will outlast all of it. The elevated trains on their old tracks, the lake doing what the lake did, the lights coming on in 1,000 windows where 1,000 lives were proceeding in the ordinary, difficult human business of becoming something other than what they started as. Inside, 2 people who had found each other in an alley in the rain sat in the waiting room of a small clinic and talked until it got dark, and the flowers from the corner store leaned in their water pitcher on the counter, and Sandra locked the supply room and turned off the backlights, and paused in the doorway long enough to confirm what she was seeing before she slipped out the front door without saying a word, leaving them exactly where they were, which was where they needed to be.